Now, NDE Radio, a weekly exploration of near-death experiences and similar encounters with the other side. Now, here's your host, Lee Witting.
Welcome to NDE Radio with Lee Witting. Whether you're listening on TalkZone, by podcast, through the archives of our ad-free shows on our YouTube channel, or connected through our Facebook page. It was the year we held the IANDS conference in San Antonio that I got to know Thomas D. Abraham. He was there to represent the International Academy of Consciousness, the IAC, and spoke about that organization's goals of teaching people how to initiate their own out-of-body experiences, as well as achieving other explorations of projecting consciousness beyond the body. Thomas was a PhD student of cognitive neuroscience at the City University of New York, and then transferred his studies to the University of Denver, along with his research through the IAC. Some recent studies on the nature of consciousness, which I plan to look at on next week's show, were already being explored in a hands-on way back then at the IAC, and I think you'll find Thomas Abraham's insights very interesting. Thomas, when you go through an out-of-body projection, what do you typically see?
That's very, very variable, and I think a lot of it depends on the dimension in which you find yourself. One of the things that we do is we try to have people have a specific projective target, and this will kind of help them almost dictate where they go a little bit and what they encounter. And one of the wonderful targets that we can have is to try to target the time between lives. What we would call an intermissive period in which the consciousness is preparing for their next life. And in this case, we would basically set a mental intention to try to reach this experience where we might find like ourselves in almost like a class, so to speak, learning how to prepare for the next life or doing assistance, this type of thing. Thomas, in a case like that, is the person remembering a past life the way they would under hypnosis, or are they actually traveling back to see it from the spiritual side? Well, it can be both. So, in one case, we can think of literally trying to reach almost like a dimension that you would have spent time between lives, and so we could call this almost like your extra-physical hometown, so to speak. And this is a case where you would basically be projecting and seeing perhaps even colleagues of yours that are also between lives, part of your karmic group, for example, and you would be able to interact with maybe higher, more mature spiritual consciousness. We would call them helpers or spirit guides, this type of thing. But as to your question about recalling a recollection of past lives, what we find is that when we are out of the body, because your conscious experience is no longer being mediated through the physical medium of a brain, there's a little bit less identification with this particular personality, with this particular incarnation. And it actually renders itself to be more accessible to a greater picture of who I am, right? Because I'm not just seeing myself as Thomas Abraham in this life, but I have much more access to memories and experiences from previous lives, if that makes sense. And part of that is because I'm not local to my physical body, where that kind of egocentric, me focus is really present, such as in the physical dimension.
So this is where understanding the larger consciousness comes in as a result of this experience.
Absolutely. So I would say the end game of this is not necessarily to have OBEs for OBE's sake. We focus on the out-of-body experience as a tool for self-research and also for, really self-development. And what we see is the crux of that is evolution, the evolution of and maturation process of the consciousness, and assistance. So how are we aligning our lives to benefit others? And part of that realization that comes from having that out-of-body experience is that I am more than just my physical body, but I have a physical body. So then the question is why? Why am I here in the first place? And so it allows us to kind of get in line with what we consider our life task or existential purpose, however you want to phrase that.
Right. Now, our mutual friend Gabe, who's also involved in the IAC, or perhaps is the IAC, has talked about encountering spirits on the other side, ghosts, if you will, and some of them seem to be stuck. Now, when you're over there, do you feel some sort of ethical obligation to help them?
Yeah, and one of my recent experiences that I was going through my journal and looking at, and I'd actually read the transcript of it, I actually found myself in you'd almost seem like an extra physical clinic, working with spirit guides and just kind of learning that type of assistance, in which they were taking less lucid people that had recently transitioned to death and helping them kind of regain lucidity, regain awareness to the fact that they've actually passed on, so they can kind of help them move things along, essentially, and detach a little bit from their attachments from this last incarnation. So yes, we certainly have an obligation, and I think that greater multidimensional awareness also calls us to a higher level of ethics. The more we know, the more we oblige ourselves to be assistential, not just to people in a physical body, but to all life everywhere. And this is the term that we call cosmoethics, the greatest expansive universalistic application of ethics that you can think of. But I think an important point there is that as we also develop our parapsychism and we're starting to become a little bit more aware that we are constantly interacting across multiple dimensions simultaneously, even when we're in our physical bodies, that obligation does not cease once we've come back to the physical body, that we can actually do assistance to those types of consciousness even when we're in the body, and we should.
You've used the term cosmoethics, and it sounds very much like universal love. When you think of each of us individuals growing out of consciousness through experience, do you see us as individual cells or genes, part of a larger body, maturing ourselves into a single body of universal consciousness?
That is really a fantastic question, and there's certainly some theoretical framework for that. A lot of people have a word, they maybe put it in religious terms of calling it God, or, other people may refer to it as this kind of like the quantum mind, what have you. And it's a really tough question, because we certainly experience ourselves as individuals. And even with an expansive, let's say, conscious experience such as the out-of-body experience and realizing you're much more than your body, we still tend to primarily identify ourselves as me, even if I'm recognizing me as having multiple lifetimes, right? So it's very difficult to even fathom what that would mean. However, some people do have experiences which we would call almost like a mental somatic projection, which is not a projection in this astral body, but is really like almost like the pure essence of their consciousness is no longer local. And in this case, sometimes people call it a nirvana experience or cosmo-consciousness experience. I know several NDEers who have had something similar where they really find themselves not even operating in a body at all, but just interconnected with that love, interconnected with all things in a place where there's no time and there's no space, and it's like equal possibility and probability all at once. And so there is, definitely people that kind of have this perspective that maybe part of our maturation process is this de-identification with this personal ego and almost like a reunification with this grander cosmic scheme. And it's certainly it's an attractive and appealing idea. I think that we need to really approach it almost like a scientific approach. We want to keep gathering experiences and keep codifying the data and kind of come to some kind of corroborative understanding of what that really means. But it's certainly a possibility, and it's certainly an interesting idea for sure.
I know people, when I bring this question up to people who've had NDEs, it's almost scary, the thought of losing your own ego. And they say, oh, no, we maintain our individuality through everything. But one of the speakers at the NDE conference talked about how he was afraid of losing his identity. He felt himself being absorbed into the light, and at a certain point, he just didn't want to give up his own self, as it were. And I think that's possibly a problem. And maybe we just have to reach a high point of spiritual maturity before we can give ourselves up to the grander picture.
Absolutely. And I think, a good starting point is starting to understand cosmoethics, because cosmoethics is about, putting all life on and all consciousness as having value, and it's not something independent of yourself. It's something that you're interacting with and that you have an obligation to. So to be selfless to some extent is part of cosmoethics, right? And in that process, we hopefully will come to less and less identification with our own little microcosm of the universe, our own little ego spirit, and can really start to at least empathize with other consciousness and start to realize that we are interconnected. And if we experience ourselves as individuals, our thoughts, our emotions, our energies are interacting in this field and affecting all life and all consciousness everywhere.
There's a monk, or I guess he may be deceased now, an Orthodox monk in Cyprus named Daskalos, who talked about our thoughts going out like spirits, and he called them elementals, but he said the nature of the spirits that you project, the vibrations you send out for good or for evil, really affect the whole world. Does this sound similar to what you when you talk about mental soma or cosmic ethics? Is this what you have in mind?
Absolutely. So when we can say how do we judge cosmoethics? Well, it's a subjective bar, right? But we can look at the product of consciousness. What are we producing as a consciousness? And we have a term that we use that I think is brilliant, because it finally gave me a word to put on something, this concept that I'd had for years of thosine. And what a thosine is a unit of consciousness. It's a production of our thoughts, our sentiments, and our energies, such as our bioenergies. So you can think of this in our daily physical lives where, you're producing a thought, you can materialize that as an action. But on any dimension, we are creating thoughts. Our thoughts have essentially a frequency. These are combined with the emotional qualia and the bioenergies, and these are interacting in multiple dimensions simultaneously. And these thosines have repercussions, and they are affecting other people, whether they're explicitly conscious of it or not. It still has an effect. And so you can imagine it's kind of like, well, if you go into a room and someone has just had an argument in there right before you came in, sometimes you can kind of sense that vibe. Well, that's basically the thosines that are affecting the whole environment, right? Similarly, compassion meditation, for example, maybe having a really actually direct effect where it's not just affecting the meditator, but it is affecting their target of this feeling of love and compassion for all people, even those that are difficult, right? We are creating a positive outcome, even if we don't see it directly, I think. So, absolutely.
So you're saying these vibrations are residual, that they hang around. For instance, if someone moves into an apartment where a murder has taken place, they may feel the negative vibrations without actually experiencing the ghost of the murdered person.
Yeah, absolutely. And they can actually become crystallized into what we would call a morphothosine, or like a thought form. A good example, and Luis Monero talks about this. He's the president of the IAC. You could have an old house, let's say, that you move into, and you have an out-of-body experience, and you're exploring your own house during the out-of-body experience. You look on the wall, and there's this old painting on the wall. But you come back to the body, and that painting's not there, right? But then you find out later on that, in fact, that painting had been there for several decades, with the previous owners. And now that's a new house, new owner, they've repainted and everything. That painting is no longer there. So this is an example of how with everyone seeing that painting for years and thinking about it and putting their thought energies towards it, it almost takes a crystalline form on another dimension. And it's of course more subtle than the physical dimension, but when we're in the out-of-body experience, we can actually experience and see these things as if they were real, tangible objects. So thoughts can actually be crystallized in a sense. And this is also a good point about having fixed ideas. When we start to create paradigms and we create institutions that are promoting fixed ideas, these things can really become difficult on other dimensions as well. And I can think of like any kind of pathological thought pattern that's anti-cosmoethical, not only affects us in the physical dimension, but, has negative repercussions on the other dimensions as well.
The Buddhists talk about this as being, this world as being like a matrix, a fantasy. And I gather from your point of view, it's really as real as the other side, and that somehow or other the two are interconnected and working together all the time.
Yes, I think that in a sense, both of those perspectives are real. So one thing that's interesting with the level of lucidity that we can achieve during an out-of-body experience, for example, we can actually have hyper-awareness, greater lucidity than we do in the physical body. And many people report during the out-of-body experience that dimension feels more real than this dimension, that this is the sleep, this is the dream, and over there is the real life. The way I kind of visualize it, though, is that the physical plane is really kind of maybe the densest expression of the consciousness, that all of these dimensions are interconnected, that we're part of all of them simultaneously, but that, really this is the densest physical expression of the consciousness. But it has a purpose. And, I think one, kind of idiom that expresses that is the Earth School concept, that we're all here to learn, to develop ourselves through restriction. We are much less restricted on the other side. But here we're experiencing everything through this very limited sensory experience, and with a very limited physical brain. Our actions are limited, but this has a lot of affordances as well, and it puts us in different situations with different experiences, different people, allows us to basically run scenarios, and hopefully through this process we are developing and learning to be better people in general.
One of the things you said in a talk you gave that really struck me was that all the biodiversity in the world, all the amazing differences that don't really get accounted for in Darwin's perception because they don't really make sense. If they are all varying ways of consciousness expressing itself and just experimenting and playing with the physical world, it sort of explains why you can have so much diversity and so much novelty in our physical world.
Yeah, absolutely. And would we just look at human consciousness, think about all of the cultures, all of the environments, all of the body types, all of the groups of people, there are so many different experiences possible on this planet. And that's why I think the reincarnation cycle, if you want to call it that, this multiple lives, this seriality, is so important to our development and growth, because it allows us to see both sides of the coin. Imagine in one life you were born in Palestine on one side of the conflict, and your next life you're born in Israel on the other side of the conflict, right? You have the wounds from both sides, and hopefully the positive things from both sides as well. And I think that this is part of the teaching process, because when we identify so much with our own little ego, we only see things from our one little perspective. This cycle actually forces us into new perspectives with new people and new affinities. And I think that's really important to our growth, which is also why I feel some of these projects that are being taken on by, the technology sector for expanding life indefinitely are not only futile, but really kind of cut us off from that process. We do need new experiences. We need to undergo this cycle of death, and death is an important part of life. even our own lives.
Those who've seen the movie The Men Who Stare at Goats know governments and corporations will try to use remote viewing and any other techniques for spying or stealing secrets or planting lies. So what's to stop the United States or Russia or China from using OBEs for such purposes?
Really nothing. I mean, how could you stop that? And that's an unfortunate, direction that some people may choose to take. Our hope is that in having direct experience with these states, and coming to that realization of being a multidimensional consciousness that's, literally interconnected and interwoven into the very fabric of life itself, that kind of epiphany may change our affinities a little bit, so that we may see the error of that other more nefarious direction. And I always kind of muse at that, because it is kind of a funny thing that here you are with this, realizing yourself as this consciousness that's so much beyond your physical body, and yet this is the best that you've come up to do with it, is to spy on a neighboring country. It's really kind of silly. And it very much reflects a materialistic, short-sighted ethics, not a very universalistic ethics, of course.
Right. Has the IAC ever been approached by government with something like that in mind, or have you heard of any cases like that?
I have heard of cases like that. I don't know that our organization specifically has been approached. I know the other organizations that have. And I think part of it is that we have flown under the radar for quite some time. I mean, we're not as well known of a name, but that could certainly change as we are branching out and participating in more of these national conferences and things that such as the SSE and some of these that our speakers have gone to. So, yeah, it's definitely a possibility. I can tell you that's something we would not be interested in, but they can certainly ask.
What would the possibilities be of, while you're out of body, running into somebody like that from the CIA, for instance?
Certainly anything's possible. One thing that we find, though, is that where you tend to go most easily is, and I'm going to say place as if it's a place, but you think more of a dimension. We find ourselves in dimensions where we have a lot of affinity, right? So we're more likely to meet other people that are kind of like us, essentially, that are, kind of at this certain level, which may also be why it's sometimes difficult to get direct contact with your spiritual guides, because they are operating at a higher frequency, for lack of a better word. Likewise, it's also a little bit difficult to find yourself in the most awful and depraved environments that are out there as well, because we don't have affinities to that. But that's not to say that it's not possible. It's just saying that where we're most likely to go is somewhere where we have a lot more affinity. So in that respect, if you had, let's say, a friend or a colleague that is also practicing lucid projection, and you guys have been talking and things, it's much easier to encounter that person out of the body, for example, than, say, someone that's with the, trying to do espionage or something like that.
What would the difference be between OBEs and remote viewing?
Oh, that's a good question. So I kind of think of remote viewing almost as like you're bringing the information to you. So it's almost like watching, and just say for lack of a better example, it's like, the difference between visiting Spain versus watching a documentary about Spain at home. I think what is really occurring during a remote viewing episode is that you're, kind of out of phase a little bit with your consciousness, and are actually part of your consciousness is definitely tapping into that information and kind of directly resonating with it. But the subjective experience, let's say the quality of the experience, is not being there. It's that you're kind of receiving information. Whereas with the out-of-body experience, with high lucidity, that environment, you will be immersed as being there. And you'll be perceive yourself in a body, which we call the psychosoma. Oftentimes you'll hear referred to as the astral body, smooth body. There's any number of synonyms for this. And that body will look very much like your physical body. It will even be wearing clothes as a kind of almost a projection of our own self-image, essentially. But there's some other attributes of that body, such as the ability to permeate walls, or elasticity, for example. You can kind of grab your own fingers and pull them and watch them stretch. So importantly, you will know, in a degree of high lucidity, you will know that you were at that physical environment. You were there, versus just kind of getting information or perceiving it, if that makes sense. And so kind of getting back to that Spain example, it's like if you're touring Madrid, for example, you wouldn't doubt that you're actually walking the streets, for example, in your physical body any more than you would in the out-of-body experience. You would know that you were there.
One of the things you've mentioned as being a targeted area is that space between lives where where someone who's having an out-of-body experience will intentionally go to the time between their past life and this life. What have they seen in that environment?
Yeah, oftentimes there's actually a great, I believe, Brazilian-produced movie called No Solar, which really kind of explores that time between lives. It is a dramatic cinema piece, but I believe it was actually based on some there's some kind of information that's being presented there that seems to be pretty reflective of this. In any case, these types of environments may in some ways resemble our physical lives, where we would see like structures or buildings and almost like physical places. But we tend to be, encountering colleagues and other consciousness that may themselves be between lives, but people we've known in past lives and people that we probably will have work with in the future. These environments, of course, will be kind of perceived differently depending on the person projecting. And, of course, we may not all be coming from the same hometown, so there's some variability in those types of locations. But certainly I would encourage the listeners to think about this and try to target this because, it definitely can be very illuminating even into, like, what our purpose in this life is, kind of reconnecting with some of the planning phase that we went through in preparation to come here. Also, this is a good way to kind of connect with some of your spiritual guidance as well. I don't know what else can I tell you about that?
We had a guest who recently who said that when she was in she was having a near-death experience basically, and she said as she was walking with the spirit guide through this beautiful garden or field, I guess. She said she had the sense that as it passed by over her, it disappeared. And the spirit guide explained that this was created to make her feel comfortable. And so it was like a special effect for that individual. Do you suppose that we all have that kind of reaction between lives as well?
Certainly, and I think a lot of the individual differences would depend on the state of the consciousness. Someone that's kind of passed on with, full lucidity and awareness is going to have quite a different experience than someone who's less lucid, maybe a little bit more pathological, more kind of akin to being stuck to attachments of this past incarnation. And I think the near-death experience itself is somewhat of a special case. If you were to really kind of disentangle some of the differences between an NDE and an OBE, we would still say it has this out-of-body experience component and would be thought of as like kind of a forced projection, if you will, as opposed to one provoked by will. But oftentimes, I in the NDE experiences that I've read and talked to people about, it seems like a very much almost an intervention or a course correction. And people dramatically change the direction of their lives and try to reintegrate into their, the purpose for being here. And so I think that sometimes those environments that NDEers find themselves in are almost a little bit more specialized and customized because a lot of work has been put into place in order to bring them there so that they can have this kind of tailored experience. Versus, the whole spectrum of out-of-body experiences can be anything from like, well, you fell asleep and you found yourself kind of like floating around your bedroom in a semi-lucid, not very aware state, and then came immediately back to the bed or to the body. And that's, of course, like a little bit more mundane on the whole scheme of things. Not to say that these really intense and life-changing experiences can't happen with OBEs. They certainly do, and that's kind of the objective. That's why we would want to train this to do this at will, so we can kind of get to some of these benefits and after effects of the NDE without actually having to have the NDE itself, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. But certainly in the case that you're talking about, I think that there was some spiritual guides and maybe a team of extra-physical consciousnesses trying to facilitate that condition for that specific circumstance.
So if someone has an NDE and they come back and they say, I've seen heaven or I've seen God, they might have less an accurate representation of heaven and God than someone who can recall an actual death experience and in an OBE relive that time between lives.
Right. I think, the words that we use are kind of interesting. We are using words that are from our own conditioning of being in the physical body. Our concept of God, for example, is not even the tip of the fingernail of the complexity of the universe, right? It's just it's a label that allows us to easily associate some ideas. And that can be an illuminating concept. If we reflect on that, it can open and act as a pointer to a much bigger, wider reality. Unfortunately, it can also be a very limited construct as it becomes a fixed idea. And so when people kind of go over and they're bringing some of their own conditioning and biases, it also can kind of skew the interpretation of the experience. But I think the most important thing is what they come back with at almost like an emotional and psychological level. I don't think it's problematic that NDEers say they experienced heaven, as long as they're communicating that universalistic love that comes as an after effect of being there. Now, what we call heaven is really kind of biased by our own interpretation of what that even means. It's, to us, it would just be a positive extra-physical reality. But this is something that we can use the out-of-body experience to really kind of get a corroborative evidence of what's going on there. And certainly, even a lot of the NDEers that I've spoken to that talk about heaven also acknowledge that we're in a kind of multi-existential cycle, or a cycle of reincarnation that we've had and will continue to have many lifetimes, which is, of course, not very congruent with our traditional Catholic concept of heaven. So, yeah, I think that the terminology is sometimes a little bit confusing, but I don't have any doubts that the NDEers are reaching something that would be an approximation of what our concept of heaven is. It's just maybe not such a fixed concept that we have here on Earth, if that makes sense.
Yeah. If a near-death experience is an intervention, especially designed for that particular person, then distressing NDEs where people have visions of demons or isolation or even hell would also be a specially designed intervention. Do your OBE experiences reflect any reward or punishment system on the other side?
I wouldn't necessarily call it reward or punishment. I think that's a kind of an oversimplification. But you could imagine that let's say, we'll just throw up a hypothetical, you're very, very pathological in this physical life, and you have maybe some severe addictions and, some kind of depraved behaviors and mental postures. Well, that can continue on after death, okay? And because of that aspect of affinities that we talked about, you'll find yourself amongst others that are in that same state. And, last time we talked about this concept of thocenes and holothocenes. Well, everyone having the same kind of thoughts and emotional quality and energies can create these kind of manufactured environments that very much would resemble what we might call hell, okay? But is a punishment system of these are the people that did not follow this specific doctrine. That's not really how we see it. We see it as maybe, a collection of lost, confused, not very lucid and highly pathological consciousness that we see as a temporary condition. Now, it may last for a long time. When I say temporary, it could be the equivalent of many, many Earth lifetimes that someone might find them stuck in this environment. But it's not an eternal damnation. It's really kind of a matter of, helping these consciousnesses wake up, regain lucidity, and start making the conscious and volitional choice to improve. And, eventually we would hope and expect that these people would re-enter the physical life cycle again so they can accumulate more experience and work on their maturity.
So if the vibration, the phosphine that we send out, is of a low-grade quality and it draws us to others who have similar low-grade qualities, you're saying that would be a form of hell?
It would, to the perceiver, yeah. I mean, it's hell in the sense of like we find ourselves in a negative and sorrowful type of environment. It's not hell in the sense of, I don't believe a deity dictating punishment. It's more karmic in the sense of like this is what we're resonating with and this is what we find affinities to, and therefore we find ourselves there.
Right. So how do we stop ourselves from falling into that same pattern? How do we how do we save ourselves if you want to describe it that way?
Right. Well, so the bigger question is how do we change our affinities? How do we improve our affinities? Right.
Right.
And there again comes into the idea of cosmoethics. And our expression of cosmoethics is going to be reflective of our level of maturity. So it's not to say that, in my current present state of being that I'm going to have the best absolute, archetypal expression of cosmoethics, but I am hopefully working to do the best I can. And that's all that anyone can ask is that, you're working in the best you can with the best that with the information that you have. And hopefully that is a continual process of improvement. It may take several lives to really get there, but, hopefully we're seeing some improvement and maturation of the consciousness. And I think that, another aspect of this is as more and more people start kind of resonating with these more positive thinking and ideas, it starts to create a field of energies, right? And so either other consciousnesses that are kind of interconnected with us, even if they're not directly physically connected to us, start to benefit from that higher vibration resonation, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. So, someone like, you and I are talking, but that's creating an energetic field. Other people listening to these ideas start to resonate at that frequency. And I think that anyone kind of caught in the web of that stands to benefit.
Right.
And it goes back to, I believe you were talking about last week about, the effects of meditation and
yes.
How that resonates out, right? So same kind of idea.
So we have to hope that the people that use OBEs for growing and meditation for growing are going to somehow their phosines are going to somehow outweigh the CIA guys who are trying to, or corporations who are trying to steal secrets. In other words,
it's certainly a much more sustainable model if you think about it. When you think about where we are as a planet right now, pushing ourselves, past the point of the planet's ability to sustain life, for example, whether or not we're successful at this, I think it's an important endeavor to take on, that we are, hopefully trying to raise the vibration, if you will. And these, of course, are metaphorical words. I don't necessarily mean the literal vibration, but, if we're raising the vibration of the planet, raising the frequency of the planet through better manifestations of our own phosines, hopefully we can hope that there's a positive net effect of that, and that more and more people will start to kind of experience these, I guess, more cosmoethical principles.
Right. Now, you have talked about going out almost as a missionary into an out-of-body area where some spirits you find are perhaps addicted or obsessed with something from their past lives, and you can somehow lend them energy to get beyond their current state of affairs. How does that work?
Well, you can think of for one thing, we have this kind of dense energetic body that acts as the mediator between the astral body and the physical body. This comprises the chakra system of the body. And when we have an out-of-body experience, it elongates and stretches, and that's what forms the silver cord, which maybe you've heard about or read about. And so this dense energetic body has a lot of, utility in that respect, in that we can lend the energies from that, our bioenergies essentially. And, sometimes a lot of the pathology of the consciousness between lives can be, needing that energy, needing some they're essentially like almost energetically anemic. But, this is definitely going to vary on a case-by-case basis. It certainly depends on the particular situation, of the consciousness in need. And, of course, the spiritual guides will be there, generally facilitating these types of actions. So it's not, I don't want to give the impression that's me out there cowboying, going it alone, saving consciousness. The experience I found myself in was really, I would say, assisted in the sense that I was kind of like, not just a fly on the wall, I was helping, but it was kind of like, like my toddler helping me do the dishes. I'm kind of learning what this whole thing's about. I'm not by any means like leading the charge here. But the helpers or spiritual guides definitely can use those dense physical energies as that kind of energosoma, we call it, which they can actually kind of purpose that for assistance. And, you're basically lending your energies to be assistential.
Do you think there's any danger in doing something like that they might take over, move in on your spirit?
No, I mean, I think of that's one of the big fears, of course, of having an out-of-body experience is like, well, while I'm out, maybe less than reputable consciousness might step into my body and take over, right? We think of it as kind of like a lock and key mechanism. So because your energetic body is directly coupled with your physical body and your extra-physical astral body, it's really a one-to-one relationship between those things. So it's not like something else can just step into that place. We do have to be careful how we use our energies, and really, we don't want to be, even in the physical body, we don't want to be careless with our energies and start to couple with more pathological consciousness and then not have a means to decouple, if that makes sense. So some of the techniques that we do in the classes, for example, is a we call it a velo, which I won't go into too much about the acronym, but it's a circulation of the energies in the body, bringing them to a high vibration, raising the frequency essentially, and cleansing all of the chakras en route. And this helps to kind of break up any attachments or affinities, and also, can allow us to be in a little bit denser, more negative environments without necessarily becoming directly physically and extra physically affected ourselves in a negative way, if that makes sense. So it's energetic self-defense. And these types of self-defense we can do outside of the body, and it's certainly encouraged outside of the body. And will also help raise the lucidity of the person, too. That's one of our techniques for kind of waking up a little bit more when you get out of the body.
You've said cryogenics is a stupid idea, and that death is important for our growth, basically, so that we have the opportunity to move on and experience new lives and have new insights. And there's a term that you coined that I didn't quite understand, which is morphophosine, a crystallized vibration, I think you described it as. Is that the same thing as cryogenics?
No, not exactly. So morphophosine would be, let's say, we all got together in a room and we just put our thoughts on this imaginary apple that was sitting in the center of the room, and we all just thought really, really hard about it, put our energies and exteriorized energies towards it. Then someone else maybe had an out-of-body experience and was looking at this. They might actually visually see an apple there. It's like the thoughts that we are all sending out become a pattern, and that pattern has a subtle vibration and becomes that apple. It's not, it could be dissipated, and we could exteriorize energies towards it and dissipate it. But the more we can think of like thoughts and patterns coalescing on similar ideas, these things can be a little bit more and more crystallized on the astral plane. And so the example I gave was the painting, for example. If you had a painting on the wall for decades and people are looking at it and thinking about it and thosinizing towards it, someone, even if the painting was moved, someone could project to that location and see that painting still on the wall as if it was physically there, when really It's just the thought reflection of it. With respect to cryogenics, that was really more about, and I know that there's actually a more accurate term for this, but anything that is trying to extend physical life indefinitely, to me is a way of kind of cutting us off from this reincarnation process and from really the experiential benefits of having multiple lives. Right, so it reflects an ethic that's rooted in root physicality as opposed to cosmoethics, if that makes sense.
Yes. Wow. I did have one last question, and not much time left, but there was, when we were talking about a person going back in an out-of-body experience to the time between lives, do you think they're actually going back to the actual experience, or are they drawing information from some collective source of information? They talk about all consciousness being contained and all knowledge being contained in one place. Are they actually going back in time, do you think, or are they just drawing these memories out of a memory bank, a cloud, if you will?
That's a really interesting question, and it seems the more subtle the dimension, the less that time is even a construct. Whereas we experience, in a lot of our interpretation coming back, we are experiencing things in a linear time. When you talk to a lot of people that have an NDE, for example, and they have been to this nonlinear, equiprobable space of pure mentality, right? And then trying to come back, and that's why it is ineffable, some of these experiences, how they're trying to come back and express it in a linear fashion as if it was a sequence of events. So I think that there's a lot of dependencies that happen when we're having this out-of-body experience. When we are kind of targeting that extra-physical hometown, we're actually trying to target it as if it was a place that we've been between lives, a place where our colleagues may be there, working on their skills to prepare for this next life, where we have a lot of karmic affinities, for example. So we're trying to target it as a place. But certainly during an out-of-body experience or even in the body, we can have retrocognitions or memories of past lives that can come to us. And we may even draw memories of that extra-physical intermissive period that happened between lives, almost like as a memory, if that makes sense.
My thanks to Thomas D. Abraham for this illuminating conversation. To learn more about the International Academy of Consciousness, go to iacworld.org. And thanks for listening. If you'd like to hear this show again or any of our more than 500 archived ad-free NDE interviews, go to TalkZone's NDE Radio site and hit the Past Shows button, or go to our YouTube channel, NDE Radio with Lee Witting, where you can subscribe to and comment on the complete NDE Radio library. And listen next Monday, 11 a.m. Eastern at TalkZone for more NDE Radio. I'm your host, Lee Witting, saying once again, thanks for listening.